So the climate diet connection, to me, is very similar to what we are facing in personal health. So we need to talk about lifestyle interventions for the climate, just like we talk about lifestyle interventions for chronic diseases. And so I use the cow in the room as the symbol for the climate diet connection. But people don't want to talk about something, but that is the root cause. And you need to start addressing it honestly. So I'm a systems engineer. And so I'm beginning with the assumption that nature is a perfect system design. And nature really knows what she's doing. And we have to figure out what it is that we have been doing all along and what this lifestyle intervention is all about. So I'm going to set the context in time. Okay. Climate has been changing for millions of years. It's not the first time, but what we have done today is we have accelerated it. So if you look at the temperature of the Earth over the last 650,000 years, and this is temperature that was reconstructed by drilling through the ice core in the Arctic, and then slicing the ice core layer by layer and analyzing the air bubbles that got trapped. Okay, that's how they reconstructed the temperature, and they reconstructed the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So the CO2 levels in the atmosphere is shown in blue, and the temperature is shown in white. And present time is on the right-hand side. The left-hand side is 650,000 years before present time. Okay, so you see the temperature has been going up and down. In fact, over the last 3 million years, the Earth has gone through over 100 ice ages and warm periods in between the ice ages. So today, I mean, we are in a warm period, okay? But over the last 650,000 years, there were about 10 ice ages that happened. And most of the time, the Earth was in an ice age. And very short times, it was in a warm period between ice ages. And during this time, the Earth spawned us as a species. Okay? And we got control of fire about 500,000 years ago. That's when we were able to start setting fires voluntarily. Okay? And so that was during an ice age. And then 50,000 years ago, we got control, we got partnership with wolves. So wolves became our friends. They became our dogs. And with their help, we were able to move out of Africa and go to every part of the world. So we spread from Africa to every part of the world. And because it was during an ice age, we had to change our diet in order to do that. So we had to start eating more animal foods and so on, because food was scarce where we were going. And then in the current warm period, which is on the right-hand side, you can see it looks exactly like the warm period that happened 3 ice ages ago. But instead of coming down to another ice age again, the temperature stayed flat, and it actually is now going up a bit. And similarly, the CO2 levels went up like crazy. So you look at what happened during this warm period closely, and you will see that human beings, our ancestors, started heating the climate about 6,000 years ago. So this is the CO2 level in the atmosphere in red, okay? And what is shown in blue is what happened 3 ice ages ago. So our current ice age, our current warm period matched what happened 3 ice ages ago until about 6,000 years ago, and then it takes off. And that is the human effect. So our ancestors did that by cutting down forests and raising animals for food. So agriculture happened, right? And so the methane levels also went up. And methane and methane and CO2 are the 2 major greenhouse gases that are heating up the climate. So we started heating up the climate actually 6,000 years ago and deviating it from the natural trend. And this prevented the Earth from going back to another ice age. So if you look at the temperature of the Earth, it came out of an ice age 20,000 years ago. It was in an ice age. It came out of an ice age about 10,000 years ago. It went over the glaciation threshold. And then it reached a peak, and it was supposed to go back another ice age 5,000 years ago. Instead, the temperature stayed flat. And because the temperature stayed flat, we were able to do agriculture. So agriculture and human interventions, they basically happened together to keep the temperature constant. Okay, and then we discovered fossil fuels about 200 years ago, and we started burning them as well. And industrialization caused the temperature to go up by another 1 degree Celsius, about 1.2 degrees Celsius right now. And today we are at this critical juncture where we have to decide whether to continue heating the climate and possibly cause a near-term extinction of our own species, or we transform, and I call this the greatest transformation in human history. We transform our lifestyles to come into alignment with nature and therefore cause the temperature to reverse and reach the same steady state level that we were at 200 years ago. And we can keep it there. Okay, so that is the transformation that's happening right now. And so we heated the climate through a system. So I call it a climate heating system. And that system is based on deception, on domination of our species over all other species, based on death for animals, diseases for human beings, and destruction for the planet. So I've called this the 5 Ds that are driving the current system. So it's based on deception, and I show a satellite picture of what is happening in the Amazon. So you can see the deforestation in the Amazon is not happening uniformly. They leave little clumps of green behind. And they do that because there is a scientific convention in the UN that any 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid that has 10% tree cover is classified as a forest. So even though they have been deforesting here, they have been pretending that they did not deforest because there is 10% tree cover. Okay? This is the kind of deception that's causing us to heat the climate and simultaneously destroy the planet. So how do we go from climate heating system to a climate healing system? Well, the foundations of our system need to change from deception to honesty, from domination to humility, from death to health, from disease to happiness, and destruction to harmony. So can we create a system based on honesty, humility, health, happiness, and harmony? And it turns out that we have created systems like that, especially when we do engineering projects. That's what we do. Engineering projects have to be based on honesty, on humility, on coming into alignment with nature. And so the key there is to have a common objective that all humanity can agree on. And that objective in this case is to heal the climate and to maintain it for all of creation. Okay? So if we can agree on that and say we want to change our lifestyle to come into alignment with that, we will solve the problem. Okay? So we know about the dietary deceptions. Dr. John McDougall has 4 deadly dietary deceptions on his website, mcdougallfoundation.org. The protein deception, which is to convince people that protein is only found in meat and then make them eat the meat. The calcium deception is to convince people that calcium is only found in milk and therefore make them consume milk. The third is the omega-3 deception, which is that omega-3 fatty acids are only found in fish. So every industry sort of finds its own selling factor and then pushes that as the only source of that selling factor. And that's how we have been eating bad foods and therefore getting sick. Okay? The fourth is the starch deception, that starch makes you fat. Okay? So these 4 deadly dietary deceptions, this community knows all about that. I don't want to go into more detail on this. So, but what I want to show you now is that there's been a similar deadly deceptions in the climate literature as well. And this is created recently. It's not like it happened over years, right? So it's only about 30, 40 years old that we started doing this deceptions on how to present climate change to people so that they're not doing the right thing. First is the narrow timeline deception. So I'll go into some of these details in my presentation. Second is the methane averaging deception. In the narrow timeline deception, you only look at 200 years of climate change and don't look at what happened before that. And that makes you focus on fossil fuels as opposed to animal agriculture. In the methane averaging deception, they show you, the impact of methane over a 100-year period. Even though methane only lasts in the atmosphere for 8 years. The half-life is 8.4 years. So methane becomes CO2. And when it is methane, it's an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. And therefore, if you really wanted to address climate change honestly, you would have to address methane first. But that's not what we are told. Third is the airborne fraction deception, which is only 45% of the CO2 we put into the atmosphere stays there. The other 55% is absorbed by nature within the first year. Yet we count all of the CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, and we count the net of the deforestation and afforestation CO2 emissions from animal agriculture. So by changing how we count, we make fossil fuels look much worse than they really are, and we make animal agriculture look more benign than it really is. The fourth is the natural cycle deception. There are a whole bunch of emissions from animal agriculture that are not counted because we say, oh, animals are part of nature when it comes to that. Okay? And fifth is the opportunity cost deception. And that's all the land that we're currently using for animal agriculture. There is an opportunity cost. What does that mean? It means that there is, every day we are eating animal foods, we are saying we don't want the forest to come back on that land. And we are preventing the CO2 from being sequestered in forests. And finally is the opportunity benefit deception. And I'll show you a model that explains these two. So if you look at land use versus fossil fuels, this is data from the carbon CDIAC, which is an organization, the US government organization that takes, that has been keeping account of all the CO2 emissions over years, okay? And between 1850 and 2000 present time, you see that there are 5 different sources of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And this has been causing the CO2 level in the atmosphere to increase. Currently, the main source, it's all fossil fuels. It's coal, oil, gas, and cement is the last one. And land use is about 15% of the total. Land use change comes from deforesting land, right? But CO2, once you put into the atmosphere, will stay there for a long time if you don't allow forests to come back. Okay, the half-life of CO2 is in the hundreds of years. So they tell you also that CO2, 20% of the CO2 will last for tens of thousands of years once you put it into the atmosphere, which means that you have to look at the CO2 emissions that happened tens of thousands of years ago as well, not just from today until tens of thousands of years ago. So we have to accumulate the CO2 emissions over time, and that's what really causes climate change. When you accumulate it over time, even from 1850 on to present, you will see that land use is actually number 2 to coal. Okay, it's the second most important factor. And third is oil and then gas when you accumulate over time. But that's starting from 1850. When you start from 10,000 years back, land use turns out to be the leading cause of climate change. It actually overwhelms all fossil fuel sources combined. And the number one reason for land use change is animal agriculture. This is why animal agriculture becomes so much more important than even fossil fuel emissions. Now, this data is there in the IPCC's reports, but you have to dig through it to understand. This is what the carbon cycle diagram from the IPCC is showing. I've tried to simplify it in the next diagram I show you. Basically, what it's saying is that land has 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. Okay, so and it's all in the form of vegetation and soil carbon. Permafrost is another 1,700 gigatons of carbon, and that's frozen soil. Fossil fuels, there's 14 known reserves is 1,471 gigatons of carbon. And of that, we have taken away 365 gigatons of carbon and pumped it into the atmosphere. So there is still another 1,000, more than 1,000 gigatons of carbon, fossil fuels, still left underground. Okay. And what Dr. Jim Hansen says is that if we take all that carbon that we know in fossil fuels and burn it, the Venus syndrome is a dead certainty on planet Earth. Venus syndrome meaning in Venus, the surface temperature is 460 degrees Celsius. So if we burn all the fossil fuels that we know today, we will cause the Earth to become like that. And that's what Jim Hansen has said. This is why a lot of this fossil fuel carbon has to stay in the ground. We cannot keep burning it. Okay? But land has 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. And on land, we have taken away 30 gigatons over the past 200 years. Because the Earth is a self-healing mechanism. Even though we are taking carbon from the ground and we are cutting down forests, the Earth has found a way to sequester that back. So if you look at the emissions that we have done over time, before the industrial era, we took 300 billion tons of carbon from the land and we cut it and we burnt it. And that's what this deforestation arrows stand for, the purple arrows. So the 300 billion tons we put into the atmosphere, and that 300 billion tons came back and got stored in the Arctic as peat moss. Because nature compensated for that. Okay, so this is the self-healing mechanism in nature. Of the 164 gigatons of carbon we added from land change from 1850 onwards, 134 also came back down. And that came back down in the form of increased CO2 storage in trees and soil because the CO2 level in the atmosphere went up. And that's called the CO2 fertilization effect. Okay. So then we took 365 gigatons of carbon from fossil fuels and burnt it and sent that up. Of that, there's another 155 gigatons we estimate has gone down into the ocean. The ocean has become a sink for carbon. So overall, only about 240 gigatons of carbon is still in the atmosphere. Even though from 10,000 years back, we have added 300 plus 134 plus 164 plus 365, about 820 billion tons of carbon. Okay, so 70% of that has been sequestered by nature. Only about 30% is still in the atmosphere. So that's what has happened to the carbon cycle. Okay. But the key thing to note is that land has 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. And this is a block diagram showing how land is being used. And this is also from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and where the biomass from the land is going. Okay. So most of the land is being used to graze our animals. That's 37% of the land area of the planet right there. And you see this big black arrow, that's how much biomass is being taken out of that land and being used to feed our animals. So cropland is providing 6.3 billion tons of biomass. And all this is in the form of dry weight. Okay? So it's all from dry weight, and then the flow shows how much of that dry weight goes to feed animals, how much of that goes to feed human beings directly. Directly is in this little arrow, and this is through an industrial food processing block. So processed foods, we are eating more processed foods than vegetables and fruits directly. Okay, and these arrows are the waste. So one thing you notice right away is that the waste from animal foods, the waste from animals exceeds the total amount of food that we eat. Okay, in terms of dry weight. So this is a very complex block diagram. So I just took out, and this includes also other industrial activities. So other industries are also using animal inputs. This is why, to me, whole food plant-based is to human health as veganism is to planetary health. Okay, for planetary health, you have to be vegan, not just whole food plant-based. You have to be whole food plant-based and vegan, meaning don't use animals for any purpose whatsoever. If you don't use animals for any purpose whatsoever, then this entire block, these two blocks go away, which means all this biomass that you're feeding to the animals, you can save and use that to regenerate forests. So if I just look at the food biomass flows, I simplified that diagram. From grazing lands, you get 3.87 billion tons of biomass. And from cropland, half the cropland output is going to feed animals. More than half, actually. So total is 7.27 billion tons that goes into feeding animals. And the animals are providing us with 0.26 billion tons into this industrial processing block, from which 0.19 billion tons comes to our plate. So this is why I say the reduction going through an animal is 39:1. That is 39 grams of food have to be fed to the animal to get 1 gram of animal food out. Okay. So 0.26 billion tons is directly we take from the crop land and feed it to ourselves. And 1.52 billion tons goes into the industrial processing block, and out of which comes 1.09 billion tons. There's about 500 million tons of waste from the industrial processing block. Okay. So overall, 85% of the food we eat is already plant-based today on the planet. Only about 15% comes from animal sources. 12% comes from land animals, and 3% comes from sea animals. So this is just a simplification of the IPCC's block diagram. And IPCC has updated it a little bit. And so now it's not 35%, it's 37% of the land area of the planet that's used for grazing animals. So, so I've taken this data and mapped it onto the satellite map of the world. Okay, so this is the satellite map of the world. It shows the deserts, it's growing. The desert that started at the western edge of Africa is now going all the way into India and becomes the Thar Desert, goes all the way into China and becomes the Gobi Desert. It's just one contiguous desert. And then we have desertified Australia, we're desertifying the US, we're desertifying South America. So we are sort of desertifying. There is a saying that forests precede civilization and deserts succeed them. But the question is that the only way to live? Can we not live by bringing back forests, right? So that's the next point I'm going to be making. So if you look at the land use, how we are using land on the planet, human beings are actually using 91% of the land area of the planet for ourselves. Only 9% is left for wild animals. And that is in the original forest. So here I've taken the satellite map of the world and I mapped into it the land usage data from the IPCC. So which basically says that if you take all the land that we're using to grow foods for, plant foods for human beings and put it in one area, it'll cover Australia. That's about it. Okay, about 7% of the land area of the planet. That's providing us with 85% of the food we eat. If you take all the land that we're using to grow our animals and put it in one area, it will cover all of Europe, most of Asia, and a little bit of Africa. This is the red area. It's about 43% of the land area of the planet. That's only providing us with 12% of the food we eat. Okay. You take all the land that we're using for biofuels and put it in one area, it'll be in the bottom half of Africa. If you take all of our cities, all of our railroads, all of our highways and put it in one area, it'll fit inside Madagascar. Okay, a little bit more than Madagascar. It's about 1% of the land area of the planet. And most of the so-called forests on land are really timber. So those are monocultured forests. Okay, it's what they call forestry, not forests. So that will cover all of North America, all of Central America, and a little bit of South America. And original forests, and even in the original forest, as I showed you, we are deceiving ourselves into thinking that it's still forest when we are deforesting the Amazon. Okay, so that's where the wild animals are living. And this is why wild animal populations have been plummeting. Okay. Now, if you take the CO2 on land, I told you that there is 3 times as much carbon on land as there is in the atmosphere, right? If you look at where this land, where the CO2 is stored on land, the carbon is stored on land, turns out that 98% of the carbon on land is in this white area, where we grow plant foods, where the original forests are, where the biofuels are, etc., and the timberland. Only 2% is where the animals are grazing. Only 2%. This is why if we all go vegan, then we can return all this land back to nature and bring back the CO2 levels on land, increase the CO2 levels on land by returning the forest back on land. And this is the reason why I say animal agriculture is the leading cause of climate change, responsible for at least 87% of greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. And the claim there is that if we all go vegan, you will see the CO2 level in the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere decrease by at least 87%. Okay? So there'll be an emissions decrease because we are not grazing animals. There will also be a sequestration of CO2 because the forests are able to come back. And that's the bigger component, actually, of that. And because of our land use and how we are using land, the planet is literally dying. Okay? So we can actually map it out and see how fast the planet is dying. The wild animals, we decrease the total weight of wild animals by 58% between 1970 and 2012. And it became 68% by 2016. It was 52% by 2010. So you can see the trend, 52 to 58 to 68. It's going down so fast, right? We are on track to hit 100% by 2026. And the bad news is that if we hit 100%, it's hard for the planet to recover. So we reach a point of no return, because there are hardly any wild animals left. And simultaneously, there are climate tipping points that are also telling us that we need to change by 2026, at least, right? So, and I'll go through details on that, but we know that there are 6 different tipping points in the climate that are estimated to be less than 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase. What is a tipping point? A tipping point is a point beyond which it's impossible to bring it back without making drastic changes to the CO2 level in the atmosphere. There is so-called hysteresis effects that happen in these things. So West Antarctic ice sheet collapse is already started, and we think the tipping point is between 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. So if we increase it to beyond the tipping point, and right now all these tipping points are showing that they're going in the wrong direction. The only way to know whether we have hit a tipping point or not is by reducing the CO2 level in the atmosphere and seeing whether these systems respond in the right direction. If they don't respond in the right direction, we have to reduce the CO2 level even more. Okay, so that's what hysteresis is all about. So there are 6 different tipping points that are in the less than 2 degrees Celsius range. There are several that are between 2 to 4 degrees Celsius range, and there are several that are greater than 4 degrees Celsius range. Okay. So the facts, I'm going to show you just facts, because to me, facts cannot be disputed. I'm taking it straight from the IPCC's data. So 77% of the agricultural land area on the planet is used for raising animals, while 23% is for crops. Since half the crops are fed to animals, animal agriculture accounts for 86% of the agricultural land area of the planet today. Okay. And it's not providing much food for all that land that we are using. 7% of the ice-free land area of the planet is providing 85% of the food we eat in the form of plant foods. Animal agriculture takes up 43% of the land area of the planet while providing just 12% of the food we eat. And seafood is the remaining 3%. So it's really about substituting 15% of the food we eat from animal sources to plant sources. And that will allow us to reach a vegan world, right? And if you look at the heating on the planet and the different gases that are causing heating, and this is again from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the effect of CO2 that we have added to the atmosphere since 1750 is like putting a 1.68 watt bulb on every square meter of the Earth's surface. So that's what this is saying. 1.68 watts per square meter is the impact of the CO2 that we have added to the atmosphere since 1750. The impact of the methane that we have added to the atmosphere is about 0.97 watts per square meter. There are all these other gases like nitrous oxide and HFCs that are also heating up the climate. So every gas that we put into the atmosphere either heats the climate or cools the climate. It has no choice to do one or the other. And that's what every complex gas will do. So there are some gases that we put into the atmosphere that cool the climate. Those are called cooling aerosols. And they cool because they're reflecting energy in the visible region, whereas the heating gases are reflecting energy in the infrared region. Okay, that's why they heat. So the cooling gases are sulfur dioxide mainly, and cloud aerosols that form out of sulfur dioxide. So we are heating, with CO2, we're heating 1.68 watts per square meter. With methane and other gases, we're heating by 1.7 watts per square meter. And with the cooling aerosols, we are cooling by 1.1 watt per square meter. So overall, we're heating by 2.29 watts per square meter. Okay. So now you look at how do we modify this in order to start healing the climate. And it turns out that the most important thing we need to do is to reduce the methane, because methane has a very short half-life. So every year, a lot of it is disappearing. Okay, so because it has a very short half-life. So a lot of it is disappearing. And if we don't emit any more methane, you will immediately see the impact of the methane reduction. Whereas CO2 takes a long time. And for CO2 to accelerate the reduction of CO2 in the atmosphere, we have to bring back forests. That requires a total lifestyle change. So this is why when the IPCC shows you the impact of methane, they're actually averaging the impact of methane over 100 years. So they're saying the methane is like 10.1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent because they averaged it over 100 years. If we average it over 10 years, methane is now equivalent to 47.2 billion tons. So if you average over 10 years and you say that I'm looking at the impact over the next 10 years because I know that climate change is happening within the next 10 years, it's going to reach points of no return. And therefore, we have to intervene within the next 10 years. This is why it's important to look at it at a 10-year time frame. And if you do that, the CO2 we're emitting into the atmosphere is only 17.6 billion tons of CO2. That's how much is staying in the atmosphere at the end of the first year. And methane is equivalent to 47.2 billion tons of CO2. So that's what it will look like, the reality. This is what I call the methane averaging deception. That's in the IPCC reports. So the fact 3 is that each and every day, the methane that's emitted from animal agriculture causes more incremental planetary heating than the CO2 from all fossil fuel sources combined. And then we wrote a paper showing what happens if we restore the original ecosystems on the land that we're currently using for grazing animals. And we showed that we can actually sequester 265 billion tons of carbon, which is more than the 240 billion tons of carbon we have added to the atmosphere since 1750. So literally, we can reverse climate change if you just bring back the original forest that used to be there. And this calculation was done by just taking each grid and replacing it with the original ecosystem grid, and then adding up the numbers in the model. So fact number 4 is that land stores 3 times as much CO2 as the atmosphere in the form of trees. and vegetation and soil. In fact, the weight of a tree, if you look at the dry weight of a tree, okay, which is you take the tree and you take all the water out of the tree and then weigh the tree. Roughly twice as much CO2 has been sequestered by the tree as the dry weight of the tree. Because the tree stores the CO2, it breathes in CO2, carbon dioxide, and then it converts that into hydrocarbons and stores it in its bodies. Okay, hydrocarbon basically is carbon and hydrogen compounds, right? And roughly half the weight of the tree is carbon. Half the dry weight of the tree is carbon. The other half is other compounds like other molecules like nitrogen and hydrogen. Okay, so but CO2, if you look at the weight of the carbon in the CO2, it's 1/4. This is why double the weight of a tree is the CO2 that is sequestered from the atmosphere. So the land stores 3 times as much CO2 as the atmosphere. Though constituting nearly 60% of the ice-free land area of the planet, the grazing land used for animal agriculture and deserts contribute just 2% of the CO2 stored on land. Why is that? Because we have cut all the trees in that land. So in the past 10,000 years, humans have cut about 3 trillion trees, about half the trees on the planet, mainly to raise animals for food. Okay, there used to be 5 to 6 trillion trees on the planet. Now there are only 3 trillion trees. So if we all go vegan and bring back the trees that we cut, we can literally reverse climate change. That's the data, right? That's the data. Data is showing us that. So if we restore the native ecosystems on the grazing lands that are currently being used for animal agriculture, we can reverse climate change. So I model this. I'm a systems engineer. So I model what has been happening. And then I look at the solution space in the model. So I did this model using 2 machines. The burning machine, which is burning all the fossil fuels. And mainly it's for our consumerism, okay? Because we have been convincing people that happiness comes from more and more consumption. This is the axiom of consumerism that's driving our system. And then the killing machine is the other machine. So these 2 machines have separated that out. And I took all human activities and put them in one of these 2 machines. And then counted the numbers as to how much emissions is coming from each of these machines and what can we do to solve our problems. So that's the climate bathtub model. So in the model, there is a baby sitting in a bathtub, and there is 1,000 liters of water in the bathtub. And that corresponds to the 1,000 billion tons of CO2 that we have added to the atmosphere since 1750. So every number in this model corresponds to something in reality. Okay. And the bathtub is filling up with 2 faucets. One is the burning machine faucet that's pouring 35 liters per minute. That corresponds to the 35 billion tons of CO2 we add to the atmosphere every year. So 1 minute is like 1 year in reality. And 1 liter of water is like 1 billion tons of CO2 that we add to the atmosphere. The killing machine is pouring 15 liters per minute, which corresponds to the 15 billion tons of CO2 equivalent that the killing machine is causing to go into the atmosphere. Now, if you just look at the faucets alone, you may think, oh, you need to focus on the burning machine and ignore the killing machine for the time being. It's also convenient. You don't have to talk to people about their lifestyle, right? You just tell them to go buy electric cars. And so that's what people have been doing. But there are more complications to the model than just the faucets. There is an aerosol tank, which corresponds to the cooling gases I showed you before. And that has 350 liters of water. That corresponds to the 350 billion tons of CO2 equivalent that the cooling gases are causing in the atmosphere. And so the model says that for every 1 liter per minute that you turn down the burning machine faucet, the aerosol tank is going to open up and let 10 liters pour out of the tank into the bathtub, because we lose that cooling effect. All the cooling gases come from burning fossil fuels, not from the animal agriculture industry directly. Okay. Now, the animal agriculture industry is preventing 30 billion tons of CO2 from being sequestered on the land that's currently being used for grazing animals. So that's what's represented by the drain of the bathtub. So this says that for every 1 liter per minute that you turn down the killing machine faucet, the drain opens up and lets 2 liters per minute pour out of the bathtub into the vegan reforestation tank. So we are estimating that on that land that we currently have hardly any trees, it's used for grazing animals, we can potentially store 2 trillion tons of CO2 or 2,000 billion tons of CO2. So that's the 2,000 liter capacity of this tank. Okay. So this is the model. And then in the model, you explore the solution space. So I've done several animations I'm going to show you. First animation I'm going to show you is doing nothing. If you do nothing, what happens? And I'm going to assume that the baby will drown if the water level goes over 1,200 liters in the bathtub. Now, you could argue whether it's 1,200 liters or 1,250 liters, but somewhere in that region, we're going to hit a point of no return from which the baby is going to drown. Okay. So first animation I'm going to show you is doing nothing. Second animation I'm going to show you is just turning down the burning machine faucet by 15 liters per minute and not doing anything to the killing machine faucet. And the third one I'm going to show you is doing just the killing machine and not doing anything to the burning machine. And then we'll do both. And we'll then explore the optimum solutions within this. Okay. So the first animation, if you do nothing, the baby will drown in 4 minutes because there's 50 liters per minute pouring into the bathtub and the water level will reach 1,200 liters in 4 minutes. So which in reality is like 4 years. Okay, so you understand where that's coming from. Second is I'm going to just turn down the burning machine faucet by 15 liters per minute. And I'm going to show you, and these are the only 2 things that people are talking about. They're not talking about animal agriculture. They're only talking about the burning machine, turning it down and then doing nothing. The other side is saying do nothing. So if you only turn down the burning machine faucet, the baby actually dies in 1.4 minutes. Why? Because you're turning it down by 15 liters per minute, which means that 150 liters is going to pour out of the aerosol tank into the bathtub. There's only 50 liters left now. So that is filled up in 1.4 minutes. So the baby dies sooner. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why people are only talking about these 2 options. All our governments, all of our climate scientists, and they're not looking at anything that has to do with animal agriculture, which is where the key to the solution is. So there's a profound lack of systems thinking in our mainstream discourse. Third is if you only do the killing machine and don't do anything to the burning machine, if you turn it down by 15 liters per minute, then the drain opens up and you're going to pour 30 liters per minute out of the bathtub, 35 liters coming in, 30 liters going out. The bathtub fills up at 5 liters per minute. And therefore, the baby dies in 40 minutes. So you buy yourself time. Okay, but still the baby dies. As any plumber will tell you, if you have 2 faucets pouring water into a bathtub, you have to shut off both faucets. Otherwise, eventually the bathtub will fill up. Okay. So the fourth animation I'm going to show you is doing both. If we turn down the burning machine faucet by 15 liters per minute and the killing machine faucet by 15 liters per minute, then the water level goes up to 1,150 liters and then starts coming down by 10 liters every minute because there's 20 liters pouring in, 30 liters going out. And as the water level comes down, you can start turning down the burning machine faucet more and more and more and eventually shut it off. So that's how you would solve climate change. So then you ask, what is the optimum solution? And I'm looking at optimality by looking at the total level of water in the bathtub and minimizing that level. So I want to reduce the maximum level of water in the bathtub. Okay? So that turns out the minimum you need to raise the water level in the bathtub to solve climate change is 63 liters. So the water level will go up to 1063 liters and it will stay there for about 30 minutes. And then it will come down. And that requires us to shut off the killing machine faucet right away. So that's the optimum solution. shut it off right away, and turn down the burning machine faucet by 6.3 liters per minute. And then start lowering it as the aerosol tank empties. So that's what this optimum solution is saying. So which means we will have 6% more CO2 in the atmosphere than what we have today. And it'll be there like that for about 30 years in the optimum solution. And then eventually we will reverse climate change. And how do we do that? By bringing back the forests. So that will change our lifestyle. So right now we are focused on individuals extracting money for ourselves and resources for ourselves. That's our goal in the current lifestyle. In the new lifestyle, it's all about bringing back the forests. So we have to take care of each other. So that has to be a given. Healthy food should be a given. Shelter should be a given. And then our focus is on restoration of ecosystems, because we are becoming a climate healing species. To me, climate healing is an engineering project with 8 billion engineers on the planet, and all of us following some modeling. And then, in engineering, we model things and then we implement according to the model, and then we refine the model. Because as the implementations are done, we see that some of our model parameters have to change, right? Now, suppose you say, hey, we cannot shut down the killing machine faucet right away. It'll take us, say, 5 minutes. So it's going to be 5 years before we become a vegan world. Then the water level will actually go up to 1195 liters. So the baby will almost be drowning. And it will stay there for 33 minutes. So 33 years, it'll be like that. So that difference between shutting off the killing machine faucet right away versus shutting off the killing machine in 5 minutes, that difference is actually the true cost of eating animals today from a planetary perspective. Okay, so it's enormous. There's a tremendous amount of suffering if you are going to keep the water level at 1195 liters for 33 minutes. The baby is almost drowning. This is why I say it's important that we get to a vegan world as quickly as possible. So this is our moment of choice. We have to decide, are we going to transform our lifestyle and come into alignment and become a climate healing species? Or are we going to continue with our current model of economic growth at all costs, and it's all about individuals taking things for themselves, all the deception, domination, all that nonsense that we have been doing until now. Do we continue that, or do we change? Do we transform? And it begins, I say, with healing food being easily available to every human being on the planet. If we make this happen, free access to healthy, whole food, plant-based, universal vegan meals is a basic human right, then you'll transform the system. This is the easiest leverage point for transforming the system. And we started doing that. And we had a tremendous response last year when we did that, November 19th. So many people from around the world did this, started giving out healthy food for people. And Mayor Adams in New York has signed a proclamation for us, asking the people of New York to participate in making healthy food being freely available to their neighbors. So that's the proclamation he gave us. We also got a proclamation from Orlando, city of Orlando, for the same thing. That's the book I wrote. This is how my granddaughter helped me understand how to heal the climate. And that's called The Pinky Promise. You can buy it on Amazon. I've been doing a book tour with that. And, overall, the principles are simple, right? Yeah. And this is from the movie Cinderella that my granddaughter took me to see. Have courage, be kind, and all will be well. Even on the planet, that's all it is. Be kind to all life and all will be well. And we have to change our lifestyle to do that. Just because it is what is done doesn't mean it's what should be done. So we don't have to continue doing the same thing just because we've been doing it all along. And finally, we have to imagine the world as it should be and act for it, as opposed to the world as it is. So, and, it's something that the mainstream media also seems to know, but they're not saying it. once in a while you get something like this. They said that they recognized me as the foremost voice on the true scale of societal change required to save the planet, which means they knew, except no one ever says it. So this is the dam of denial that we need to burst through, okay, so that we need to put everything on the table and say, we are prepared to change our lifestyle as a society and then heal the climate. So with that, I'm going to stop.